So I want to shoot a little bit of a video today here on escape from evil, and I'm going to talk just about the first couple of chapters here on the primitive world and this notion of techniques and how those related to circulations of power. I think the first thing to really underscore um, for Becker is that he suggests that, and this is the quote right from the preface, he says, "In this book I attempt to show that man's natural and inevitable urge to deny mortality and achieve a heroic self-image are the root causes of human evil." And I think it's it's really important to understand the history of, I guess, of social inequality and of the, I guess, the sort of understanding of life as a dynamic mystery that people felt indebted to, dependence upon, and not that the earliest people tried to bribe, but I do think you want to see a kind of an attempt to keep power circulating, to keep the life force energy circulating. This is so much of what the earliest peoples were doing. If you try to look at things like sympathetic magic and homeopathic magic and the different kinds of magic, for example, that you find in the Golden Bough, um, so much of what Becker is trying to do is to maybe reveal the way that people sought power in its visible manifestations and sought to rally strength around it, by it, through it, with it. I think we all, when we were young, we've had that experience of seeing someone and they almost have like an aura of powerfulness, of life-sustaining capacities, and people love to be near that person. They want to draw sustenance from that person. I think in very similar ways, there are people who seem to have the evil eye upon them. They bring hardship, and we try to avoid that. We see that as a life draining person, as someone who maybe liquidates power and or is a kind of negative power. And this notion of power and of, I guess, of life sustaining mystery, I think was very evident to earliest peoples. It was almost overwhelming how much there would be suddenly abundance, and then there could be great scarcity, and people would wonder what they had done to bring about either of those conditions. There seemed to be a recognition of one's actions as having a bearing in the larger world. Now, I think we could say, well, we're skeptical of that, and we want to say, well, you know, the rain dance and the different forms of trying to petition nature's forces to do our bidding. I think we can be skeptical of that and see that as problematic. But I don't know if just saying, well, that's wrong is going to help us. I think it's important for us to now say, well, that's not a very practical way. But I think for historical perspective, we do want to understand how people felt connected with the world. Now, you know, Kenneth Burke has very interesting arguments where he suggests that criminality in many of its forms today is a resurgence of people trying to experience that kind of teleological worldview. That people who get involved in criminal element of the culture, they oftentimes feel as if everything they're doing has a sort of secret significance, or as it could be watched. It's everyday actions bristle with a kind of animated concern. It's as if you're continuously under a watchful eye. I think the point that I just want to say, to really stress in this first couple of chapters, is to try to get at the origin of inequality. Now, for Becker, I think he's going to suggest that one of the critical or most important questions we need to ask is why was there a surplus generated in the ancient world? From where came the impetus to accumulating surplus? Now, if we want to think of it in terms of just a kind of rationality, and people were, accumulating goods so as to have enough to make it through harsh conditions, I think we're overestimating a certain kind of rationality and we're underestimating a different one. That is, there is a kind of mythic narrative rationality that is operative in consciousness, which is very different than a mathematical calculating kind of consciousness. The argument that Becker is going to give, and I think it's a very good argument, is that the origin of surplus begins as a gift to the gods. It's an attempt to free up the circulating, life-giving powers and to keep them flowing. And the fear, see, I think in the ancient world, was that if you hoarded things, you were sort of openly demonstrating that you weren't using them and weren't taking advantage of them, and you would allow them to be wasted. Well, that would diminish the return of it. And in the same way, people thought if they could accumulate huge piles and make wastes of things purposefully, as if giving the waste as if it were a gift to the gods, that would let the gods know to keep it circulating. And so again, the notion here is that the origin of surplus and the roots of social inequality began with this struggle over the capricious, life-giving characteristics all around us. That sometimes there was abundance, sometimes there was scarcity, and in order for those peoples, these earliest peoples, to feel as if they had some sort of assurance in keeping the life-sustaining forces coming their way, what they did was they accumulated surplus to give it as gifts back in a kind of an economy of exchange and flow and circulation. I think it is, we sometimes talk this way when we say, well, use it or lose it, we say to somebody. We say, you don't want to be the richest person in the cemetery, right? We have lots of expressions where we say, now is the time to act, and if you hoard it, it may not come around again. There's lots of little folk lore and tales and little, I guess, one-liners that help people try to think about this. But I don't know if it's easy to register how dominant of a view that was for many, many thousands of years for the earliest peoples. And I think what this is going to do for Becker's argument is really try to set up a certain way of thinking about life and the way that sacrifice, the history of the origin of sacrifice, both of human sacrifice and of animal sacrifice, of sacrificing crops, of leaving certain fields left untilled for sacrificial and religious or spiritual purposes. These phenomena and trying to understand their history. I think it's one thing for us today with sort of modern scientific hindsight go, oh yes, look at these irrational people with their foolish notions of sympathetic and homeopathic magic. Okay, I think we get that. I don't think though that in doing that we're helping ourselves really understand A, how pervasive this was, and B, how it still does kind of ride in and out of our everyday practices today. I mean, we still do have people who say, you step on a crack, you break your mother's back, and if you touch that person, you get cooties. And I think many people, when they're gambling, they want to keep going on a roll. I mean, there's lots of ways that gambling culture and sports culture, and if you dress up and you're colorful enough and you wear the colors of your team, somehow that will impact your team's performance. Well, it does add to the energy and enthusiasm in the room, and if everyone's all decked up, maybe the team does get a little bit more energy or power. This notion it is still with us. But I think these kinds of logics to try to understand the earliest forms of economic practices where it was attempts to circulate life to get more life. Okay, so hopefully that's enough to whet the appetite. I know some people are reading Escape from Evil. If you haven't been looking at it, check it out. We're going to do a couple more videos on it in the next couple of days or so. Okay, thanks.